Going live. Now we're live. Now we are live. All right, I guess we're live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Google Hangout that we're doing regarding our upcoming project grants deadline, which will be April 1st, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Scott Winship. I'm the Director of Grant Making Programs here at New Music USA. I'm joined by my colleagues Emily Bookwalter and Sam Rising. Got it right this time.
Nailed it.
This Hangout is really mainly going to be used to address questions that you all have or frequently asked questions that come up. We're going to basically, if you're logged into the Hangout now, you can type questions into, I think on the left or somewhere. You can type questions, we'll see those, we can address those as they come up. If you are not logged in to the Google Hangout itself, but you're watching us, you can also email your questions to info@newmusicusa.org, and we'll be screening those throughout this session as well. Basically, how this is going to work is we're going to go kind of quickly over a few key elements of the guidelines and review criteria, and then we'll kind of jump into questions and look at the form, the application form itself. We also have a mock project that we've started that we'll be using to help sort of visualize some things and to provide context for some of the questions that have been coming up. I guess I'll just jump right in. And we had a couple questions early, but we'll wait to see if we have any other questions come in. In terms of the guidelines itself, you can find them on our website under the Grants tab. Basically, the Project Grants is a platform that supports a huge range of activity. One thing that you want to keep in mind is that the way we think about a project is one that involves new music that is disseminated publicly in some way. So that's either a performance that's taking place or a recording that's getting out to the public in some way. You can apply for a wide range of activities, including commission, musician fees, travel, copying costs, other artist fees, outreach activity fees, recording fees, all sorts of things related to that. One thing to keep in mind, though, is we're primarily interested in having our funds go to paying artists directly for their work. So we're more likely to provide funds for artist fees or direct artist expenses such as recording fees or mastering, mixing fees, things like that, rather than production costs or rental fees or things like that. That is something we rarely, if ever, fund. So keep that in mind. That said, we do have a few areas of emphasis that we have within the project grants. There's 4 areas. The first is the creation of new work, or basically commissioning fees. This is one of our larger funding areas and also a large request area. We have funding available for live music for dance, new live music for dance, and recording costs is another area that we have money specifically set aside for. And lastly, residency and community outreach activities. We're going to talk briefly about request amounts. You can request it from as low as $250 all the way up to $15,000. We do provide partial funding. That's something to keep in mind, that we have partial funding available. It's not an all or nothing sort of setup. And this year, continuing our trend from the last round, we are placing some special emphasis on grants that are or requests that are $3,000 and below. So I'm going to ask my colleague Emily to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So in response to a lot of the feedback we received from the field we did a pretty extensive feedback kind of call a few months ago, and a lot of people participated in that. We heard a lot of, I really want a priority on small grants. I'd love to make sure that small grants are still emphasized. So indeed, we have placed continued priority on grants of $3,000 and below. What this means is that we look at these grants that are requesting smaller requests and we're in the middle of a Google Hangout, Chitra, and are basically putting a very a heavy priority and emphasis on those, meaning those are somewhat more competitive, not completely more competitive in that we still do very much award projects that are requesting amounts greater than $3,000. That happened in the last round as well, but we do really want to put an emphasis on it. So what we did, there were about 40 of the last 62 awarded projects that were $3,000 and below. So that's about 65%, give or take. That may or may not be roughly similar this round. Last round we committed to a dollar amount. This round we're going to kind of see how the needs of our applicants are spread throughout the pool. So so we'll see about that. But I guess we should touch a little bit about some of the strategy that a number of people have been calling and asking us about, and how to apply and how to ask for these requests. So some people say, well, I really, my project is going to cost $20,000, but I also would really like to get at least some money to start going. Whereas other people are like, I really just can't do the project unless I have the full amount. So some people are choosing to apply now for a portion of their project with $3,000 or below. And then if it is awarded, they will continue and apply again for the same project for another part of that project in a later round. And indeed, that's fine. You may apply for the same project up to 3 times. So, and that's awarded or not. No matter what, you can apply for the same project up to 3 times. So some people are choosing to take that approach. Other people are choosing to apply for the whole, request up to $15,000 that they need, and then to make a note in their private description that they are fine with receiving partial funding. These grants that are requesting above $3,000 won't be evaluated by the same, in the same way that the smaller grants are being evaluated. However, and the criteria are still very much the same for all of them. We just, in looking at all of the grants, segment $3,000 and below and above $3,000. So just to make that clear. But when we are making the awards, we do make a point not to try and award too far under what the original request was. So if you request $15,000 and don't indicate that that it would be very useful to receive any funding, we'll say, well, we don't want to put these projects in a hard place by only awarding them $3,000 when they requested, $15,000, because then it's like, well, you don't actually have enough money to maybe complete the project if we don't know otherwise. So we try to make a practice of not putting people in that kind of difficult situation. So indicating that it's okay to receive some funds, if it is okay, is really helpful for us. Or choosing to apply with a smaller amount and then reapplying again for a different part of the project in the future are different strategies you can take. What's right for your project is totally up to you.
You can, one way to handle that in the project form itself is, if you are interested in letting us know about that, use the private description area in the budget area in order to tell us about that, if that's something you choose to do. Before we jump into too much further, I thought it might be a good idea to go over the criteria a little bit more in depth. There still seems to be some confusion about our criteria, so I'm going to walk through the 3 elements in particular and give some additional context that might be helpful. We also just recently posted on our blog some context around the criteria as well, and so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. We basically have 3 criteria for the project grants, and they are very much listed in order of importance. The first criteria is artistry, the second is impact, and the third is capacity. Again, listed in order of importance, artistry is the most important. We have a 2-stage panel process, which you can also see there on the right. There's an introduction to the panel process that talks a little bit about what happens to your project as it goes through the panel process. There is a 2-stage process. The first stage is solely, the projects are evaluated solely on artistry, and that's the artistry of the submitted work samples, the media samples that you have submitted for your project. Those can be demonstrations of current or past work, depending on what your project is, but you definitely want to think very much about what types of projects, what types of work samples you want to submit, because those are very important. Those that make it past the first stage, artistic round, go to a second stage review, which includes all 3 criteria, artistry again by a different set of panelists, impact, and capacity. Artistry itself is by nature a matter of interpretation, and there's lots of different ways of thinking about it. So when you're thinking about artistry, you want to put yourself kind of in a position of being a panelist as you look or consider work samples that you might be submitting for your project. Is the work compelling? Does it compel your interest? Does it make you want to keep listening or watching? Since it's your work sample, you might be biased on that. But step back a little bit and think about that from an outside perspective. You can, or have a friend listen and listen to it as well and get their perspective. Does the work embody a distinctive or authentic artistic voice? Does it feel fresh? Does it show highly developed craft or technical excellence? Those are all things that you might want to think about, or questions that you might want to ask yourself. Also, recording quality, although there's lots of ways that people record things these days. And we accept a lot of different types of media for our work samples, but you do want to think about recording quality to a degree. If it's really bad, like if the video is very shaky, or if the audio is very difficult to hear, those things could impact the scoring. So be careful when you think about those things. MIDI is certainly, you can apply with MIDI, although work samples, we discourage it because the panel tends to not really favor MIDI at all. So if you have live samples, those are going to be better usually, and we can talk more about work samples later. Also, with regards to artistry, you should be aware that we only give you 3 chances, at least in the projects page, to submit work samples. 3 options there. If you have a lot of collaborators, or if you feel like you have more work samples that you want to submit, put them in the collaborator profiles or your own organization profile, your organizer profile. Panelists are encouraged to peruse those if they need more information, or if they can't quite find what they're looking for. If they want to listen more, they're encouraged to explore those. The second criteria is one that I think we need to talk a bit about, and this is impact. Impact can refer to a lot of different things, and it really is very specific to the project itself. One things we ask our panelists is to take the project as a whole. What is the impact on the participating artists or composers and or the community or audiences involved? Now that can go in a lot of different directions. Is a project particularly meaningful opportunity for the composer? So maybe this is a composer's first opportunity in this type of area. Maybe it's a first recording. Maybe it's a performance, first orchestral performance. Maybe it's a retrospective, and that's certainly fine as well. Is it a meaningful opportunity for the community? Is this a well-known composer who is coming into community who's never been before? Same with the organization. Is this a new opportunity for an organization? Are you working with a new composer? Are you working in a new way around new music? Those are all things that you want to talk about in your project narrative to demonstrate impact. Also, you can talk about basically, does the project build new relationships, or does it strengthen existing ones? So are these relationships that are new, are they ones that you are building on through new music or through composers or through new performers, that sort of thing? There are a lot of different ways about thinking about impact, and I want to encourage everyone to use their project narrative to talk a little bit about the context behind what the project is. If a composer is coming in and you're going to perform their work, why this composer? Why did you choose to work with this composer? What's the relationship there? Those are all things that have become very important when the panel is trying to determine between projects that are somewhat similar or projects that are on the cusp. They want to know why this is unique, what's different, or if it's a composer you've been working with, maybe it's a community-based composer that you've worked with in the past. Why is this project special to you, and why are you asking funding for it? So those are all things to consider when talking about impact. The last criteria is capacity, and this is an area that the panel does not actually score. It's more of a yes or no sort of question, and it's basically to get a sense on whether or not they feel that the project is going to happen. Do they feel that that there's enough behind it? The relationships are there. Can they do it? Yes or no? Is the request appropriate for what they're trying to do? And be aware that unconfirmed collaborators can have an impact in this area. So your collaborators, when you invite them to be a part of your project, they have the option to, and they should agree or sign on to the project, and that confirms their participation. This is very much like serves as a letter of commitment, so to speak, letting us know that they know what the project is, they're confirmed, they're committed to it, that sort of thing. If they're not confirmed, we can see that. The panelists will be able to see whether they're confirmed or not, and that may play in a role here, especially if it's a significant collaborator that hasn't quite signed on to the project. That may not seem like things are all kind of in place there.
One clarifying point on that. The panelists can't see if a collaborator has been tagged and has not yet confirmed. They simply just don't see that collaborator on the project.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
No problem. Yeah, so that's for people who, if let's say you have like an outstanding collaboration, you're not sure yet, but you tag them in advance just in case. You won't be penal. Like the panelists won't see like, oh, why didn't that person confirm? They just won't see them on the project at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very, very important distinction. Thank you for clarifying that.
So welcome.
So that's a little bit about the criteria itself. Again, we have this blog post that went up last week, I think it was, that goes into detail about the panel's criteria and a few other things in terms of how the panel scores. On the right there, you can see that we have other resources in terms of making your work samples the best, as well as a step-through process of the panel process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to talk a little bit more about the project form itself and other questions that frequently occur.
Do you want to see what questions we may have so far?
Sure. Yeah, this is just a reminder that if you are on Google+, you can ask questions in the live stream. So you don't need to comment on the events page. You can actually ask questions in the live stream and you'll be able to see them. But we do have some questions coming in the comments on the Google+ page. So let's see.
Is there anything under that?
No. Okay,
All right.
So first question from Joshua Cole saying, I would like to know what issues to keep in mind if I'm applying for a project that has taken place before the application deadline. So for each deadline, we can award projects that took place up to 6 months prior. So if the activity has happened within 6 months before the deadline, then it's certainly eligible to receive retroactive funding. Things to keep in mind, I guess if you have work samples of that project, it would probably be smart to use those, because a lot of projects happening in the future, there's no work samples of the actual project, but just a collection of work samples from the participating artists to give an idea of what that project is going to be like. Other than that, I mean,
since it depends on when the project actually happened before the deadline, but we certainly would like to get a sense in terms of the project narrative, what happened, what went down. You get a opportunity there to really tell us what did happen and what the impact was and how it all turned out. And if you do have work samples from that project, that's ideal, certainly. If you don't, then do your best to sort of figure it out. But I mean, those are just some simple things to keep in mind. I don't know, Emily, do you have anything else?
No, that's probably what I was going to talk about was in terms of we can answer that with the next question. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is coming from Andy Lee. He asks, is partial funding that common? Would it be better to request the full amount for a project or request only the bare minimum we think we need? I think Emily touched on this earlier.
Yeah, sure. So partial funding is relatively common in our awards. We do try to make sure, like I said, we try to make sure that, if you've requested $10,000, we don't fund, less than a substantial portion of that, so that we don't put you in a tough place, where you're like, well, I got some funding, but it's not enough to actually do the project. So it is common just in our own efforts to try and stretch our resources as far as they'll go too. So we don't really feel comfortable ever asking people to request for less than what they need. It's really ultimately up to you and what you feel you might be able to do. So if you want to have a slightly more competitive project and you think you can get started with $3,000 in the event that you're awarded, then yeah, go for it. Or you can request the full amount, knowing that we're totally open to partial funding. It is common. And, you know, let's say you go through the whole thing and you're in the final pool of the top 65, and we're starting to try and make awards from our various sources of funding. You know, it's really helpful for us to see, you know, Andy said that it would be fine for us to give him $5,000 of the 15 that he requested or something, and that wouldn't put him in a rough spot. That's so helpful for us to know. So again, using the private description for something like that is helpful, but you know, how you choose to approach it is up to you.
A couple things to think about. Generally, at least in the last few rounds, the practice has been that if you request 3,000 and below, those tend to be fully funded. Usually the small requests are fully funded. That's not something we tend to do partial awards on. It depends on what it is, though. I mean, like if it's not an eligible request or not an eligible budget item, we will do partial awards on those, and we have in the past.
Like once.
But generally, the 3,000 and below category will be mostly fully funded. It's rare if it's not. If you are, you know, doing the 3,000 up to 15,000, as Emily said, we do try to do a substantial portion. I don't believe we go below about 40% of the request. We try not to anyway, but that's not a hard and fast figure necessarily. But we do want to at least provide an award that is meaningful to the project. So it's really up to you and your situation and what you feel is comfortable with. And again, if you feel comfortable, you know, taking a smaller amount, you can certainly tell us that, or if not, then, you know, we'll do what we can.
Okay. Next question is also from Joshua Cole. He asks, when applying for a recording, is there any concern about public access for the recording? In other words, how is the final project going to reach audiences? That's a great question. There's not really any huge concern as long as it's made publicly available through whether you're selling it as a CD or like even a record, like a vinyl record, download. Video on YouTube is an eligible recording. Just, I guess something that you're not going to just record and keep to yourself for future grants.
Yeah, those are the ones that don't tend to go very far. If you're trying to make a recording of your work so that you can get additional funding, that usually isn't, or if it's a work that you know, although that's a very valuable thing for composers, we realize that, but public dissemination is really important here. And the way that it's going to be about, we have specific funding for recordings, but it's not a ton, and we get a lot of recording requests. So those that are more, how do you say, more competitive are ones that are actual recordings, albums, basically albums. So if you just need a recording of one work, it's probably not going to be quite as competitive as if it's a recording of a few works or an album.
But who knows? Maybe it's a really stellar work, and the panelists are like, "Oh my god!"
Yeah,
and,
it is possible, but just keep that in mind.
Yeah. Next question from Paul Cantrell: where do panelists start? Do they listen to the media first or read the project description first? Where do they get their very first impression? Should we expect them to be reading the project description while they listen, or should we expect the media samples to be evaluated for artistry without the context of the project description?
Super solid question.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go for it.
All right.
I can do it.
You do it.
That's a good question. They have access to the project. We ask them to focus on the media itself as the primary review area, just to look at the media or listen to the work samples. We do know from past practice that some panelists will review or will skim over to get context. Usually it happens if they need a little bit more context about whose work is what. But we instruct them to focus on the media itself and the work samples themselves and evaluate based off of that. So that's the primary objective, at least for the initial listening panel. Once it moves into the second stage panel, they are looking at everything. They're looking at the the narrative, the private description, the budget, the work samples, all of that together as a whole and evaluating based on artistry and impact and capacity. But for our artistic panel, they're charged with evaluating the media samples, the work samples that are submitted, and that's their primary focus.
But it's never out of context. It's all still on the project page and whatnot.
Yeah. And I would also add that panelists do look for more work samples in the collaborator profiles. So it's another reason for your collaborators to confirm and for them to populate their profile with more information like their bio and work samples. Because if we direct the panel to look at collaborator profiles if they need more information about that artist or just curious about their other work.
Yeah. So for projects that have a lot of collaborators involved, especially, a number of people have asked, well, we have 3 work sample spots, but I have 6 collaborators and they're all total prolific artists in their field. So making sure that they have, put a couple media samples they're particularly proud of on their own profile is a great way to cover your bases.
Okay. Next question from Nina Peterson-Perlman. We have a project that has commissioning, recording, and performance elements. Is it more competitive to just focus on the recording versus the performance?
I always tell people that if they frame their project within its entire context, I think that ultimately makes a stronger impact for the panelists, where you're like, wow, I really want to go really far with this project. It's a commission and they're recording it and they're going to perform it. So having the context in your public narrative, no matter what, I would say is of utmost importance. What you decide to actually ask for is another matter, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it can go. I think having the ability to decide between those, or have the panel decide what they feel is important of the project to fund, all those things are certainly eligible, and all those things we have certainly funded in the past. So I don't think you want to necessarily limit yourself unless there's a particular need that you want to focus solely on. That's really up to you. But from our end, I wouldn't necessarily limit your need here unless there was a specific reason, or you wanted just a $3,000 for the recording and that was it. Although the project had other elements, like Emily said, that's good to talk about. It's really up to you, but I wouldn't think about it in those terms.
Yeah.
Next question from Trudy London. What happens if project budget estimates are not exact as originally stated?
Bill, I mean, within reason.
Yeah, I mean, we understand, especially with projects, we give up to 2 years out for the projects to be completed. So we know that if a project is a multi-year project, or if it's a large project, an opera or something that has a lot of resources in it, that budgets at an early stage may not be completely accurate. That's understandable. And what we're trying to get a sense of is what you anticipate being the budget for the project, or what it is. Those things can change if awarded. We'll come back around on that. But at this moment, it's what you think is the best, most accurate that you can give us at that point in time.
Next question from Andy Chang. Can one organization apply for multiple projects? Simple answer is yes. However, keep in mind that when you submit multiple projects, you're essentially putting them in competition with each other, which it doesn't necessarily mean that one would be funded over the other, but that certainly can be the case. Do you have anything else to add?
One of the interesting things about the way the panel process is, we get a lot of applications each round, and we have roughly 30 to 35 panelists working. Each panel group only takes a subset of the projects, and they're assigned panelists are assigned projects in areas of their expertise that often correlates with what you sort of tag your project as. So depending on the project and what you're planning on doing, if you have 2 projects that are disparate, they may not run into each other until later down the line. But as my colleague Sam said, it is, you may find that they end up competing with each other at some point, which is something you should take into consideration when applying. If they're completely different, what we find often is that with people who apply for multiple projects, one of them tends to rise to the top and the others kind of fall away, and it's usually not an issue. But there have been a couple where they do kind of come close to competing with each other, and that is certainly something to consider.
And something also worth adding with that is a number of presenters have asked us this question, because presenters in particular are in a particularly a uniquely challenging situation, in that often they're not necessarily benefiting from the funds that they're requesting. They're for the artists that they're trying to present. So in the case of like the kitchen or something like that, that present a lot of people regularly, that's fine. And those are actually looked at a little differently than, let's say, an organization with the same performers who are often, funding the same people, the same people are benefiting from that. So presenters, do not despair.
Next question from Sean M. Do we need to give you a budget for our project, and should it be itemized, covering fees to musicians, costs for renting locations for performances? And for requests that are $1,500 and below, we don't require an itemized budget, but anything above that amount we do. And in terms of how that budget should be set up, I don't know. You guys, I prefer that they do the whole budget for the project and then include a request amount in the private description. So you can list an itemized budget for the whole project, and then in the private description say, I want 3,000 of this to go to the commissioning fee costs, which is what a lot of people already do. And that helps give the panelists a bigger picture of the whole project.
Yeah, usually that's better to get a sense of the overall project budget, even if you're only requesting for one line item. If you're only asking for the recording costs, or only asking for the commission costs or the performer fees or whatever, that's fine. But do specify that in the private description. But it usually is better to get an overall project budget that gives us the panel a sense of the size and scope of the project, and allows them to get a better sense of whether that's achievable and all that.
Yeah, and general itemization is helpful. You don't have to, do for each person involved. You don't have to do, you can say artist fees, musician fees are going to be this much, rental is this much. So
you'll see in the budget form itself, it's pretty open ended on how you do it. So certainly do what makes sense, and try to give the best picture that you can. Yeah, without getting crazy.
Next question from Steve Coleman. It's sort of a follow-up to one we just answered. How often do you give grants to the same people or group of collaborators? For example, are there people who receive grants for different projects in multiple years?
The answer is yes. There have been repeat folks that get awarded, different rounds for different projects. That's not something we just discourage or discriminate against. But I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, we do award that. And it just depends. I was going to say something. I lost it. Go. Somebody else say something. I lost it. Somebody else say something.
It really depends. We truly go on what the panelists
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Okay, great.
I knew somebody had it. Somebody else had it.
Yeah. We truly go on what the panelists feel. We have no autonomy. In that regard, it's truly what our peers in the field who are musicians and actively working think about the project each round. The panelists change each round as well. So, there is sort of an aesthetic openness, which we want. That's a feature of the whole thing. So something that may resonate very strongly one round may not elicit the same reaction in another round, and that's fine. So, it just depends on what the panelists.
Yeah, basically, we try to find the best projects each round, sort of separate from rounds previous and rounds forward. The panel is different, so they're charged with finding the best projects that are there during that round. So that may include people who have been awarded in the past, or it may include people that will be awarded in the future, and that's fine.
Yeah. Next question from Peyton McDonald. I'm part of an organization that is applying for funding to support a festival that features over a dozen artists. What do you recommend we do in terms of media? We can't include that many work samples. So what I usually tell people is that they list up to the 6 collaborators that they can, and then encourage them to fully flesh out their profiles. But then also in the project description, you can list other artists that are involved and link to their websites and stuff. Because that's something else we tell panelists to do. they can go to their websites too and check out their websites if they need more information. And one example I'm thinking of that was sort of like this that we awarded was the Building Communities in Oregon.
Yeah,
project.
Uniting New Music Communities in Oregon.
They had a ton of artists involved from multiple cities.
27, I think.
Yeah, they just basically listed them, linked to their pages, and then used the 6 collaborator slots, and they were awarded.
Yeah, and Peyton, what we said earlier about encouraging your tagged collaborators to populate their profiles with media as well still applies. But yeah, linking is generally the thing that'll be super helpful.
Okay.
Woo!
Let's see.
Questions.
Some emailed in questions. Okay.
Okay.
Molly Shanahan asks, let's see.
My project has 4 collaborators, 3 composers and 1 dancer. So for the 3 work samples on the main project page, does it behoove me to include a dance movement sample and 2 composer samples, or to use the 3 work samples on the main project page for each of the composers and use my own collaborator page to show movement and dance samples? So I would say try and capture as much of the entire project's media within the project media as possible. So having a dance sample and having composer samples together is generally more helpful for the panelists as well.
I would say definitely have definitely. I would not say generally. I would say definitely have at least one dance work sample at minimum. The 3 composers, you can decide on how you want to do that, but at least have one work sample that demonstrates the choreography of the dancing. That's very important. The other composers, you can have them put up media in their collaborator profiles. Wasn't there a 2-part question?
Yeah.
The second part is $3,000 and below less competitive? No, opposite, slightly more competitive.
Slightly more competitive. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here's another question from George. How are community-based ensembles evaluated in comparison to professional ensembles in the artistic quality review?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. So this is an example of where impact, our second criteria, impact, does have a somewhat more present analysis. I mean, the reality is the panelists that we asked to be involved in this are all people, artists within the community who, in the field, who very much understand that like a community ensemble that's completely, that's composed of like 18-year-old kids is gonna be totally different than a professional ensemble that's been together for years and years and years. So there's definitely like context and grains of salt added or taken away. But we do very much try and find panelists who are with it, as it were, who are hip to the field and all the various manifestations that music is made within it.
Yeah. Next question from Catherine Miller. Are presenting organizations eligible to apply for funding to present artists who are creating new work? And the answer is definitely.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's actually a lot of the requests we receive.
Mm-hmm.
One may have already been answered.
Yeah, I will for now. So this is somebody from Emmy Carter asking about a festival that they commissioned, or a commission of 6 Minnesota-based artists, and it's awesome in that regard. But at the time of the submission, they're not going to know who their artists are. I'm really glad you asked this question because it is pretty important. I would say it's crucial that when you apply, you know who your artists are going to be. It is the likelihood of your project being funded without panelists knowing the actual artist that they're funding is very low, very, very low.
Mm-hmm.
So I would recommend holding off to apply until you know who your artists are.
Yeah, it depends on the timing of the project, but we usually encourage people to wait until that point. We do provide retroactive up to 6 months prior, so the best you can do is to wait. Yeah, it's too hard for the panel to evaluate appropriately in this competitive environment. So.
Cool. Sorry, we're just reading questions, guys. Make sure we see. New musical theater from Julia Malecki.
Is creating a new score. Yes, you are eligible to apply. That's fine. How likely a request for a musical theater project rather than a more traditional music genre might be able to receive funds? It's all fine. We do fund musical opera, new things like that.
I wish we got more, to be honest.
I know that often, in particular in theater, that there's a workshopping process. You can certainly come to us at earlier stages for part of the process. If you're at a stage where you want to put together a reading or a first stage part of it, as long as it's a public reading or a public showcasing of that stage, that's fine. And then you can come back later as the project progresses. We certainly fund, I think this last round, we funded about 6 or 7 theater projects. It was more in the previous round. So it's definitely something that we fund, and specifically, yes.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is that when you are filling out the project form, you can choose certain areas your project belongs in, like theater or interdisciplinary or jazz. If you select theater, then your project is going to be shown to at least one expert in theater, one expert panelist in theater. So
usually 2.
Usually 2.
Usually up to 2. Yeah.
But let's see.
I can ask you a question. You're requesting funding. Do you want to do Margaret?
Yep, Margaret. Sure.
If you're requesting funding for a community outreach event that includes a performance, does the location of that event need to be secured when the application is made? It doesn't. It doesn't have to be secured. I mean, obviously, the more things you have locked down, that's very helpful to know. But indeed, venues change, dates change, things like that.
I would suggest if you don't have a venue locked down, provide examples of similar venues or venues you've worked with in the past that will give context to where this could potentially take place. That's important. At
Use
least
a private description for that.
Either or, but regardless, it would be great to get some context in terms of where it might be performed. If you leave that out, even though you don't know, then it may feel a little funny. So provide some context, even if you're not positive. You can just give us some examples of where you've worked in the past.
Yeah, or where you're thinking about
having this. Yes, exactly.
Okay. Next question from LB Washington. What if I'm a musician, vocalist, and songwriter, individual artist? If I do everything myself and can show work samples, is that okay? Then if I choose to add 1 or 2 additional musicians to round it out, do I need letters from the musicians? I would suggest it really depends on your project. If you are an individual artist making a recording, then the collaborators aren't necessarily artists. They could be the engineers of the record company or
the label.
Yeah,
who's ever. You don't have to have.
No, you don't have to have. But
if you do have a label, the label.
Yeah. Basically, other people working on the project. It doesn't necessarily need to be artists. If it's performing somewhere, it could be the venue. Just stuff like that. But certainly don't feel you need to add additional musicians just to round it out if you're the one doing everything.
Go through.
David McDonald?
Sure. What is the best way to show or tag institutional collaborators? I'm especially interested in collaborations with non-musical or non-arts organizations that may not be interested in setting up an account and profile.
So use your discretion. You know, if they're a really important collaborator in this, you know, like if it's a, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's pretty important. If it's like a huge orchestra or something, they're going to need to commit.
Non-musical.
Oh, non-musical. Sorry.
Yeah. Talking about institutions that are non-musical collaborators, as Emily said, it's up to your discretion. Depends on how integral they are to this. If it's a hospital, say, maybe it's a hospital, you're doing work at a hospital. I can understand why a hospital might not and who the right people to get involved in that is. But put that in context in your narrative. Just let us know that this is the way it is. obviously we wouldn't be expecting, work samples from a hospital or things like that. That's not as important necessarily. We do like to know that they have some, oomph behind the project. They're committed to the project in some way, and this is one way for us to do that. You can do that in other ways as well. If they're non-musical, that's fine.
Some more questions from Trudy London. For CDs, can disc manufacturing costs be included or only actual recording costs? And is it important or necessary to add the musician recording on a CD as collaborators? Disc manufacturing costs can be included in your whole recording request. Additionally, I would say that it is important to include the musicians on the CD as collaborators, just because that gets factored into the artistry score, because obviously there's one half which is the music being performed, but then also who's performing it.
Yeah, and if you have a lot of musicians, something we've done in the past is, for people that have like 7 different ensembles on their CD or whatever, that's an exaggeration, but you can have a musician representative in some cases, and then encourage that musician to populate their profile with samples of them playing with some of the other musicians. Those exist on their own profile. So use your discretion, but if you have the slots for the collaborators, for the musicians, tag them. That would behoove you.
Here's a question from Charles Huang. Are travel costs a valid consideration for part of the budget? Yeah.
Yes. If you're traveling internationally, be aware that our funds can only go towards US-based artists and organizations. If you're a US-based artist traveling abroad, you are eligible for funding for that travel cost, those travel costs. If you're a US-based organization trying to bring an international arts organization or composer to the US, travel costs for that international artist are not eligible. So our funds are going to go towards US-based artists or organizations. But yes, travel costs are fine. We had some more on the Google Plus too.
Yeah.
Let's
So
do that one right there in the bottom. What's the distribution?
This one. There. From Andy Lee. What is the distribution of applicants above and below $3,000?
Last round was fairly. We placed a specific emphasis on 3,000 and below, so we had it a little bit more to the small side. About 60 to 65% of our awards last round were 3,000 and below, and about 35 to 40% were 3,000 above. This round will probably be more even, 50-50, but we're still working that out. But it'll probably be somewhere in that range, somewhere between 40 to 50% between the two.
Another question from Andy Lee. Is it better to tie a commission and recording to a single request or try for each separately?
It's up to you. It depends on what you really want. And how integral they are to the project. You can have 2 separate projects, one for recording and one for commission. That's totally fine. Or you can do it together. It's really up to you on this one. I don't think it's better one way or the other. Though keep in mind that you may be competing against yourself if you put in 2 projects. I would encourage putting it on the same thing, but yeah, it's really up to you.
Question from Heidi Leisman. How many projects may one be proposing or collaborating on during a single grant cycle? I have 3 possible, 2 of which are with the same organization. We don't put a limit on it. We have a lot of people that are on a ton of projects every round. Just keep in mind that the projects are competing with each other. So only one might be funded, although we've had 2 projects by the same people, mostly presenters, funded in the past.
Yeah, and certainly being on multiple projects doesn't lessen the chances of any one of them being funded. If you're not,
correct.
Yeah, you're not hurting yourself by trying to go for more.
Yeah. Here's one from Molly Shanahan. If we decide to apply in stages, preliminary development and dissemination, for example, does it make sense to include that plan, the intention to apply for the project as it moves forward toward completion in the first round?
Sure. I mean, the thing is, because the panel is different each time, you know, that's something that may not be taken into account, obviously, in the future. But I mean, the main thing that's really evaluated is still just that particular project's work samples and the narrative as it's submitted then. I guess maybe you're thinking of framing that question in terms of capacity, like is this actually going to be able to happen if you apply for a smaller amount now and then want to go later. I mean, you can definitely choose that strategy. I don't know if it
yeah, you can put it in context if you want. I'm not sure if it will make much of a difference in terms of how it's evaluated, but if you want to do that and you want to explain that to the panel, that's certainly not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay, next question from Paul. Is it advantageous to show other sources of funding, such as other grants, which could provide partial funding? I would say yes, just include it in your private description. It helps give our panel a sense that the project is going to happen. It helps the capacity score, and it gives us more information about what's already being funded, just for our own purposes.
Yep.
But it isn't integral to have other sources of funding either. For many of our awardees, this is the first funding they've received for that project.
If you have some confirmed or you have some pending, let us know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too.
Yeah. Okay. From Ensemble 212, for past projects that have already occurred, how likely is it going to be funded as opposed to applying for a future project?
Equally.
Depends. Yeah.
I mean, it really depends on the criteria and how the project is put together. It doesn't matter whether it's past or future. It really comes down to those criteria: artistry, impact, and capacity. Obviously, with a past project, capacity is kind of taken care of because it's already happened. But artistry, impact are again the number 1 and number 2 criteria. So those are going to be the main things that will be evaluated. So it's kind of equal.
More questions from Molly Shanahan. We were funded for a project several years ago. At the time, 100% of funding went directly to the composers.
That was a stipulation of the grant, correct?
Yep. In this request, can I/the dancer be included as a fee-garnering artist?
Yes. Yes, we have funding set aside for dancer fees as well, and artist fees. We fund artist fees as well. One of the nice things about this redesign and the project grants process in particular is that it frees up that possibility. What you were talking about, Molly, is our past Commissioning Music USA program, which only allowed funding for the composer part of the project versus the choreographer part. Those stipulations don't apply anymore. You can apply for artist fees and composer fees and choreographer fees and dancer fees and musician fees and all that kind of stuff.
Let's see. So Norma Martin asks, what is the distinction between small and large ensembles? We may apply for a project featuring 13 musicians. I would consider 13 musicians to be a large ensemble.
I would as well.
Would I?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
there's no hard and fast rules on that. It's really up to you. We use those designations for a lot of different things, for filtering if people want to look for projects that involve large ensembles, or people who want to look for only small ensembles. So I wouldn't get too caught up in the small versus large ensemble thing. I mean, I think 13 probably would be considered a large ensemble for a number of folks, but it's really up to you.
Yeah.
Getting all of these.
I need to check in all places.
Answer that one.
Okay.
Sorry, thanks to.
If you have any other questions, keep them coming. Otherwise, I think we're getting close to the end.
We've got a few minutes left.
Okay,
a few minutes left. So
if here's one from Paul Cantrell. Could you give some guidance on composer fees and artist fees? What does the panel consider reasonable?
We have a resource on our website. If you go to the resource section if you go to the about section on our website, there's a tab on the right that says resources. In that, we have a guide that was published by Meet the Composer, one of our legacy organizations, called Commissioning Music and Basic Guide. In that guide, there are guidelines for commission fees, for lengths of work, type of work, that kind of thing. They're very broad. They're still very broad, but that will give you some some context of what we would consider reasonable for, say, the length and the instrumentation that you have for a work. So I would encourage you to go to that. I think that's probably the best resource.
So the next question is from Brian about a musical theater project that needs funding for demos. His concern is that our funding isn't for development work.
Yeah, we tackled this a little bit in the other theater, music theater thing. Development, we understand that music theater in particular and opera have certain developmental stages that they need to go through. What we asked, though, I mean, you're asking for a recording, which is a little trickier. We'd like to have some public dissemination of this, the work. If the work was at a stage where it could be publicly showcased and then a recording made there, that would be fine. Something along those lines. So we would like some sort of public dissemination for a stage work like that. I mean, when it's done in stages. Any other thoughts, you guys?
No.
Good.
It's good. So,
Trying to read a question.
yeah, Emmy Carter has asked another question. Basically, through her particular organization, they work with Somali immigrant artists to take a lot of Somali musical culture and traditional songs within that culture and use them in new arrangements in this context and new styles. Does that fit into our organization? And the short answer is yes. New music is it's so hard to define, and we want to be really open to that. And indeed, there should be a wide expression of musical styles and culture celebrated. I mean, especially in America, like what does that even mean? So
we embrace a wide definition of new music and a wide genres, types of music, cultures of music, things like that. So yeah, that's certainly fine.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that looks like all the questions that we had. So
great. Well, right on time.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us. We will be also doing a Reddit AMA, right?
A Reddit Ask Me Anything next Friday. Time to be determined.
Time to be determined. So tune in for that, or send us your questions at info@newmusicusa.org. We'll be working hard to address them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, one more question from Steve Coleman.
Oh,
Sorry.
here we
Someone
go.
who is not a U.S. citizen or resident but is in the U.S. on a work visa, can they apply?
Yes.
Yes. They are based here in the United States, so go nuts. Apply
That's
with
fine.
them. Yeah.
Great.
Great.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.